Hello everybody, Mr. Peoples here again to cover our last section of the World War I notes, which is called Establishing Peace. And like the other three, let's start off with a joke. So knock knock, police. Please let me in, it's chilly out here. Thank you. I know you like those jokes, so I'm going to continue to say them before each of these video notes that we have. All right, you have two learning targets for today. One is that you can explain the costs of the war, not only in money, but in lives. And then the second part, the second learning target is I can summarize Woodrow Wilson's 14 points. And we'll talk a little bit more about what those are later on today. All right, some of the costs of war. The Allied countries suffered 5 million soldiers dead. America, because it came in so late, had a smaller number of wounded and killed, but still a very large number. 116,000 U.S. soldiers were killed during World War I. 200,000 were wounded. Now, the Central Powers suffered 3.5 million soldiers dead. Russia and Germany had the highest death tolls. Now, along with the human cost, there was the financial cost. There was $30 billion in property destroyed in Europe. Factories and farms throughout Europe were in ruins. The Allies spent $145 billion. The Central Powers spent $63 billion. What this meant is at the end of the war, Europe was in shambles, and it was deeply in debt. And it was going to be very difficult for those people, not just the soldiers, but the families and the families of everybody living in those countries, having to live and scrape by on a daily basis when there was nothing. Everything was gone. You can see here in this graph, Germany and Austria-Hungary, between 1.5 million and 2 million soldiers each. Russia had almost 2 million soldiers killed during World War I. Okay. Now, along with the ending of World War I, in 1918, there is a worldwide epidemic of the flu. It was extremely contagious. It was deadly, spread by the air, just like our flu that we have going on right now is, and there was no known cure. And this flu was spread by American soldiers to civilians, and then eventually to Europe and then the world. 30 million people died worldwide from the flu virus in 1918. 800,000 Americans died. So more people in America died from the flu in 1918 than were killed in World War I. It changed life in the United States. In Chicago, the flu doubled the death rate. In some states, there were quarantines, which meant that you had to stay in your house. And then some cities actually banned public gatherings, church services, school classes. Anytime people would be together with an opportunity to spread the flu, those things were banned. And so the flu epidemic of 1918 was very, very deadly. For Americans, it was more deadly than World War I. Now, at the end of World War I, President Wilson and the United States comes out of World War I as a world power. The United States, because the war didn't happen here in the United States, it happened over in Europe, all of our factories were still up and running, and we could then help to rebuild Europe. And President Wilson comes out of World War I as being a major leader in the world. And he starts to develop plans for a peace agreement after the war. And his plan was known as the 14 points. And basically, they were 14 points that dealt with how the world could prevent a war like this from ever happening again. Now, the problem is that President Wilson was dealing with European leaders from Britain and France who saw Germany as the main reason for World War I, and that Britain and France wanted to punish Germany for its role in starting the war, and they wanted to prevent Germany from ever being powerful again and being part of the world powers. So President Wilson had to deal with the British and the French, at the same time try and get his peace agreement passed. Well, some of the highlights of the 14 points deal with some of the causes of World War I. Wilson asked for these countries to end their secret alliances. No more friendships that could draw other countries into war. Encouraging free shipping, removing any kind of barriers or walls or laws that prevent countries from trading with each other. Reducing armies and navies, that takes care of the militarism stuff. Resolving colonial claims deals with imperialism. Supporting the right of people to choose their own government, settling border disputes, and establishing what Woodrow Wilson called a League of Nations, a group of countries that would be together and prevent wars like the one that had just been fought from ever happening again. Well, American and European leaders decide to meet in a town called Versailles, located in France, and it became known as the Paris Peace Conference, or also became known as the Treaty of Versailles. It took place in the Palace of Versailles and was signed in the Hall of Mirrors. And so on the left you can see the Palace of Versailles, and on the right you can see the room in which the treaty was signed. Now, it's important to note that there was nobody from Russia or from any of the Central Powers. Nobody from Germany, nobody from Austria-Hungary, nobody from Turkey were at this signing of the treaty. And so what ends up happening is the Central Powers, and especially Germany, get blamed for starting World War I. And the British and the French, along with other Allied leaders, demand that Germany accept complete blame for the war, make reparations or payments for war damages, and give up large parts of its territory. Now, Woodrow Wilson only agreed to this agreement because it included his 14 points, the steps to try and prevent a world war from ever happening again. So Wilson said, yes, I don't agree with this, but I will go along with it as long as we have the 14 points and a League of Nations created. So Wilson reluctantly signs this agreement with the League of Nations being a part of it. So the Treaty of Versailles orders Germany to pay war damages of $33 billion. They don't have that money. They're already in debt from the war. Now they have to pay $33 billion more for war damages. The Treaty of Versailles establishes the League of Nations. New countries are formed in the land that used to be Austria-Hungary and Germany. Countries like, as well as Russia, Estonia, Finland, Latvia, Lithuania, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia all became new independent nations, and Poland was recreated as a nation. The Central Powers were supposed to turn over their colonies to the League of Nations, which meant that places in the Middle East eventually went to the British and the French because they were controlled by Turkey. And then Central Power nations were broken up. So Austria and Hungary were no longer together. It was Austria was a separate country and Hungary was a separate country. This treaty is one of the reasons, and its harshness is one of the reasons why World War II happens just 20 years later. The Treaty of Versailles is set up in 1918, 1919. World War II officially starts in 1939. So within 20 years, these countries will be fighting again, and even more people will be killed. One of the reasons that Second World War happens goes back to the revenge that Britain and France had tried to put on Germany. Okay? And the failure of the League of Nations, which Wilson was a great idea, but it didn't pan out as preventing war. So President Wilson goes over to France, agrees to this treaty, and in return, he believes that the League of Nations is going to be formed. Well, you have to understand that the United States Constitution states that treaties cannot be signed by the president. They have to be ratified by 2/3 of the Senate. So Wilson comes back and presents the treaty to the Senate. But there were senators who had problems with it. Senator Henry Cabot Lodge wanted the winners to set the peace agreement, and he demanded changes immediately. Other Republicans were worried that the League of Nations was going to force the United States into using its military for some small country in the world that the United States didn't want to use its military for. So what ends up happening is almost a year after World War I ends, the Senate votes that the Treaty of Versailles should not be signed. So the United States does not sign the Treaty of Versailles. The United States signs separate peace treaties with Germany, Austria, and Hungary. Now this is a problem because when the League of Nations are formed after World War I, countries like the United States were not a part of it. And so trying to prevent another world war from happening, some of the more powerful countries weren't a part of that group. And so it becomes, it sets the world on course for another world war just 20 years later. All right, if you have any questions, as always, feel free to ask them in class. Otherwise, we'll see you back in class, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in class.